After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not be enough bread. Worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So we talked about the importance of the miracle. One reason it was important is that it was performed in front of so many people. There were other miracles that Jesus did in public, but this one definitely had the most number of people watching. It was a miracle of creation. He took a little, and out of that he created more. He didn't take something that was there and make it right, as he did with the lame man, or as he did with lepers or other people with diseases and maladies. And then it's a picture of Christ. Jesus himself said, "I am the bread of life." So it's a picture of how he sustains us spiritually as well as physically. And then the occasion of the miracle, we talked about this as well. It was during a time of rest. How do we know that? Because John doesn't tell us that, but Matthew does tell us that. And so they're calling it a vacation. I don't know if it was a vacation or not, but it was a time of rest. Yeah, vacations are more stressful than resting. So this is about where we ended. We talked about there's nothing wrong with Christian workers taking a rest, as I've done. Even while resting from earthly pressure, remain ready to serve the Lord, and then be willing to have your vacation end. By the way, none of that will be on your final or your next unit test. This just isn't really very important. But I was in the middle of telling a story, and as a storyteller, I need to finish my story. Mm-hmm. So I told you that my family went to the World's Fair in Montreal. I was 7 years old, and my younger sister was 4, and we lost Georgiana. We lost them. And my mother freaked out and said, "We're leaving," and we did. I don't know if that was the first day. Maybe it was, because we stayed at Land of Make-Believe for quite some time. But as we were making our way back, I told you that we ended up in this little teeny tiny town of Upper Jane, New York. You can Google map it and you'll see it still has like a hotel and a couple of stores and a church. And Land of Make-Believe is no longer there. One of the buildings is there, but many floods. But my father said, "Well, why don't we stop here? We've got a hotel." And so we did. And we went to Land of Make-Believe.
What is that?
And Land of Make-Believe was unlike any other place you've ever been. The man who started it worked for Disney, worked with Disney. But there were a few rides, not a lot of rides. They had little cars that you could drive on a track with no guardrails. And the home movies of me trying to drive this and my dad going, no, 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 don't crash, are hilarious. But the first thing you see is a sign that says, don't say don't. Everything here was meant to be, touched and used, something like that. And so it was built to children's scale. So there was a fairy tale land that had a castle, and there was a dungeon with a dragon in there, not a real dragon. And there was Peter Pumpkin Eater's house, and there was the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all these, and you could go in and you could play with things and you could touch things. There was this western part that had a saloon and had a horse and carriage ride, and Clayton was the driver. And I got to know Clayton. I loved horses. He took me horseback riding one of the times we went there. And then there was a church it was all built to scale. Like if you were going in there, you would have had to walk in like this to go in, because it's all built for a child's view. And more and more and more. And we had such an amazing time that we went back again and again and again for our vacation. But if we wouldn't have cut our actual vacation short, we would have never had that blessing. So think of that in the spiritual realms. There's sometimes when we have our plan, right? That this is what we're going to do, and this is where I'm going to go. And I'm the kind of person that I hate this about myself. Like I am, in a sense, task oriented. But if there's something I need to get done, and I'll even I'll tell my kids, leave me alone. I got it great. And I get this tunnel vision, and I don't see the world around me, and I don't break away from that often. But then I think we miss blessings when we do that. Right? When we're so focused on this is what we have to do. Well, maybe God has a better. And oftentimes he does. And this is a silly and not very spiritual example of this story of the land of make-believe. You can Google it and see pictures of what it looked like, but you can't see it now, what it looks like now. But anyway, yeah, we would have missed out on that blessing. If we would have just pressed on, and my dad would have said, "No, we won't lose her again." My mother would have cried. So yeah, obviously it's not the most important thing about this. So let's talk about the actual feeding of the 5,000. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" And so, why Philip and Andrew are kind of representative of us, and Jesus deliberately asked Philip where they could buy food in this very rural area, and why did he do that? Why did he ask that question? He already knew what he was going to do. Yeah.
But in case he knew what Philip was saying.
Yeah. He was going to teach him something. He was testing him. Now, look, and it says there to test him. But I want you to think of the word grow. Okay, he wanted not just to test his faith; he wanted to grow his faith. And isn't it true that often it is in the difficult times, in the trials, in the hard times that we grow the most, because we see how Jesus meets us in that trial, in that difficult time, and we learn more about who He is, okay? And we grow in our faith. And that was the point of asking that question. And I wasn't going to tell this story, but I'll probably tell it to you again at some point. The death of my father was the deepest, darkest spiritual battle I've ever waged. And it wasn't, I mean, I knew my dad loved Jesus, I knew he was in heaven. But I kept having these thoughts. What if it's not true? What if I'm giving my life over to him? What if there is no heaven? What if there is no God? What if there is? And I had these persistent thoughts about that. And I wrestled with that for longer than I would care to tell you. But here's the deal. Here's what brought me out. Not some big aha moment. Not some Bible verse that I read. Not some friend who counseled me because I didn't tell anyone. Yeah. That's an unhealthy thing to do. You're struggling spiritually, but I didn't, and I think it would have ended sooner if I wouldn't. But you know what brought me out? God never let me go. He stayed in that wrestling match. He never let me go. So I think those trials, I know those trials, those difficult times, those sad times are pivotal to help. I believe that we grow more through challenges and trials than we do through good times. Because it's the good times we're like, yeah, skate right along, right? But the hard times, that's when we have to press. Like the storm we're about to talk about, right? What do you do when you're sailing and there's a storm? What do you do? Go into the wind. You cut into the wind. And I think we grow. I know we grow. So then it's going to tell us about. It says the failure of Philip and Andrew, and their failure was looking at outward circumstances rather than God's power over the circumstances. But I want to ask you a question. Did they obey Jesus? Then I'm not going to be too harsh on them, right? They obeyed Jesus. And I believe that even with all of the miracles they'd seen him do, they couldn't dream that Jesus would do this, that he would take a little boy's lunch and feed 5,000 people. I mean, again, it's a miracle of creation. So I'm not going to be as hard on them as the curriculum is, because I don't know if I would have done any better. I don't know if you would have done any better. They obeyed Jesus, and that's the salient point. That's the most important thing, is that they obeyed Jesus. Would that we would do that too. Jesus does do this. That we would do that. So I'm not going to call it a failure. They did what Jesus asked them to do. And now let's talk about the miracle itself. Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in this place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. I heard a sermon once that said they all shared, and they brought out their own food that they had brought, and they all shared, and everybody got something. But that's not what this says. It says they ate as much as they wanted. There was no scarcity. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, by the way, we don't go that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Basically, they're saying this is indeed the Messiah. So this miracle reveals Christ's sovereignty, his power over everything. And we also see his omniscience. He knew what he was going to do. He didn't worry about it. Oh no, where are we going to get food? He knew that they couldn't buy enough, and they knew they didn't have the money to buy it, even if there was a place to buy it. But he was growing Philip's faith in asking that question. And so he wanted Philip to know for sure who he was. More importantly, yeah, he that's what he wanted. He wanted was for Philip to know who Jesus was. And then the second thing was that it required man's obedience. What is the first thing Jesus says to him? Have the people sit down. Put them in groups. And if they were like, well, there's no way we're going to feed them, so why would we have them sit down and put them in groups? No, they did it. He asked. And again, they did it. They obeyed him. But that we would all do that. So even though they didn't understand what was going on, that happened to me, I don't know, grade 10 years ago. I got a call from Mrs. Schrock. And she said, do you want to be willing to consider teaching?
Oh, yeah.
And I was talking to her. Me and you were all in first grade, going into first grade. I talked to her, and it was Mrs. Frog. I already knew in the first one year, I already had a beat on Mrs. Frog, so you knew Mrs. Frog, she's wonderful and everything. And she was talking to me about it, and it's part-time, we would still do Bible study, and yada, yada, yada. And I hung up the phone, and I looked at Jeff, and I said, Mrs. Frog just asked me to teach elementary PE. I haven't taught elementary PE since I student taught elementary. Then he looked at me and he said, oh yeah, I did that for 16 years. I can do elementary PE. And so that's how I came to that. Now I could have said, why would I do that? And I have this kid in Bible study. I mean, I'm pretty busy as it is. And but something just within me was like, yeah, let's do that. So I did it for 2 years. And I had to, so I had let my license go, my teaching license go like for decades. I mean, it had been a long time. And so I had to get a sub-license in order to. And what happened, which was unexpected. In fact, I just saw on Facebook. I saw a Facebook memory, and it was a kindergarten first or second grader, as I said, my lower level kids, and we were doing
Jump rope?
The unit we did on fitness.
Oh, you made us watch those videos.
Chaperone, right? And so I asked this little kid, and I don't know who it was. Maybe it was one of you, but I said, "Okay, so how many did you do?" 35. And I said, "Okay, 35 or 45?" And he got so, or she got, I think it was he got so upset with me. He went 35, and I'm like, "Okay, fine, that's good." We're just, and I had stuff like that happen every day. I mean, I told people all the time. Like, you cannot be unhappy when you're watching children learn to skip. It's just not, or jump rope. But I said I could sell tickets to watch my class on any given day, and I loved it. And so I was like, okay, well, if I love this, I want to keep doing it. So I got to get my license back. So I took the classes I had to take, and I student taught for 3 weeks. But I figured as long as I was getting my license back, because I was licensed in K-12 PE and 7-12 social studies. And I figured if I'm going to get some of it back, I might as well get the social studies back as well. So I student taught
called myself the world's oldest student for 3 weeks. And you didn't know it, but I was student teaching while I was teaching you. But they never came in and watched me. And then I was with Mrs. Hanson and with Mr. Kozak for my social studies. And in the middle of that, I realized I still love teenagers. I wanted, and so I walked into the teacher workroom, and the master schedule for the next year was there. And where Mrs. Hanson's name should have been instead of middle school teacher. And my first thought was, Mrs. Hanson's retiring. The kids are going to be so sad. My second thought was, and I didn't have to ask for it. They offered it to me. So for 1 year, I was middle school English and social studies. But even then, they realized that I eventually, once they could pull Mr. Hood out of the classroom and became a full-time principal, that I would be a Bible teacher, high school Bible teacher. I could have never dreamt of that. Never. In a million years. I didn't see it coming. I thought I was going to continue to teach the ladies at Brookside forever, and occasionally have a gig teaching at a retreat or at a church somewhere, which happened. Sometimes I had those gigs. I didn't dream of it. Okay, that's it. What would have happened if I would have said, noses and you got this? What if I would have said no? Basketball team.
I was about to say.
Yeah, you wouldn't have had a basketball coach. You wouldn't have had me for a basketball coach. You would have had a basketball coach. But I would have missed out on the blessing of what it is. And people ask me all the time, you still love your job? I love what I get to do every day. In fact, I have a pat answer for people who ask me that question. I say, I get to talk about Jesus to teenagers all day. What can be better than that? And I do. I love what I get to do every day. And I'm so grateful that God brought me through that path. So here's the thing. Just obey. It goes better for you if you obey. And that isn't just obey God. It is obey God, obviously, first and foremost. But part of obeying God is obeying your parents. And is obeying your teachers. And is obeying those who are in authority over you. Part of my obedience to God is obeying Mrs. Strong and obeying Mr. Hood, because they are in authority. And I mean, as one who was rebellious when I was your age, trust me, it will go better for you. And they did. They obeyed, and it went well. And then this is not an important thing at all. It does show God's orderliness. He is a God of order. He ordered the entire universe. This doesn't, however, show his manliness, so don't worry about that. It's not the most important thing, but God is a God of order. And then it reveals Christ's omnipotence. He is all-powerful. And this is much more important, obviously. And he took a little boy's lunch, a small thing, and he turned it into a big thing. God does, God does that. God often does that. That he took the tears of baby Moses to break the heart of Pharaoh's daughter. He took David's sling to slay a giant and to kill, to defeat the Philistines. Don't ever underestimate yourself. Don't ever think, oh, I'm only 15 years old. I'm only a kid. I can't do that. Yes, you. If God calls you to it, what God calls you to, He will prepare you. He will equip you for what He calls you to. God can use you. So now, Mason. Oh, sorry. Yes.
And then it shows the blessing that comes from serving. Now, the curriculum says that they each were rewarded with their own basket of food. There were 12 baskets left over. And that's possible. The Bible doesn't tell us that, though. The story doesn't tell us that, so I'm not going to say that that's absolutely certain. And I don't believe that's the, hey, look, we get a big lunch too. No, or extras, we get the leftovers. I don't think that's the real reward in this. I believe that the real reward for them and for us is the privilege of joining Jesus in what he's doing. It's the privilege of partnering with Jesus to make a difference, to help people, to tell people about Jesus. That's a reward, and a most important reward in my mind that we so now we're going to move on to 10 through 14. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them and to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled the 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who came into the world." So it also reveals Christ's sufficiency. There were 2 feeding of multitudes not in John, but in the Gospels. This one is the feeding of the 5,000. In Matthew, for sure, the feeding of the 4,000. It's in Matthew and Mark is the feeding of the 4,000. So we're going to compare these two. So they were different in number. The feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000. So one fed 5, one fed 4. And they differed in the number of loaves and fish. So the feeding of the 5,000 was 2 fish and 5 loaves. The feeding of the 4,000 was a few fish and 7 loaves. And then there was a difference in the type of basket. So in the feeding of the 5,000, it was a kophanos. So it was it didn't have a handle. It was like a small hand basket that you would carry, that the Jews would carry. And then a spurus had a handle, and it was a much larger basket, and it was used primarily by the Gentiles. So you have these 2 different baskets, and then the number of baskets remaining, 12 baskets for the feeding of the 5,000 and 7 for the feeding of the 4,000. So we see these differences. And then the other thing is that the feeding of the 5,000 took place on the western side. We know for sure on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. That's Jewish territory. That's where the Jews lived. And that was a Jewish basket. That was called that. Now, it's possible that the feeding of the 4,000 took place in Gentile territory, partly because that basket was a Gentile basket. It was one that the Gentiles used. Here's the thing. The book says that it took place on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. That's possible. But if you look in Matthew, just before the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is in either Tyre or Sidon. It says he went to Tyre and Sidon. That's also Gentile territory. But it is north on the Mediterranean Sea, not on the Sea of Galilee. So I don't know if we know for sure. I didn't look at Mark. I only looked at Matthew. I don't think we know for sure. But Jesus could have traveled back to the Sea of Galilee from Tyre and Sidon. It's just that Matthew doesn't record
What we see here, and by the way, the numbers 12 and 7 might have importance. The 12 might have signified the 12 tribes of Israel. The 7, there were 7 major Gentile nations at that time in history. That's possible. The Bible doesn't tell us that, so I'm not going to question you on that because we don't know for sure. It's possible. But if the 2 feedings were, one was to the Jews and one was to the Gentiles, I think that would symbolize that Jesus is the Savior. He is, he cares for everyone, Jews and Gentiles, yes. You know, if it was his lunch, I think it was more like a hoagie or something like that. It could have even been flatbread, I don't know. Right. But if it's his lunch, it's probably. But I don't know for sure. Let's move on then to the miracle of walking on the water. We'll get into this and we'll finish it tomorrow. Verses 14 through 21. When the people saw the sign that he had done, the feeding of the 5,000, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I do not be afraid." They were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time on this part, but you can see where Capernaum is, and you can see the other dot there. So it says that when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So he sent the disciples away, "Go down, get in a boat, I'll catch up with you," and he escapes into the kind of the wilderness of the area. And they're going to go to Capernaum. So the disciples are in trouble. And this often happens, that there is a storm that comes up on the Sea of Galilee, in part because of this thing that you've seen before, this cleft. The wind comes through here, and it's concentrated in that area. And a storm, it can be placid and calm, and then all of a sudden this wind rushes up and it becomes very billowy, very stormy, very quickly. And that's what happened here. What I want to tell you just before the bell rings, I want you to remember that a number of these men are fishermen. They have spent their lives on boats on the Sea of Galilee. And they're afraid of this storm. So that should tell you how great this storm was, because these seasoned fishermen were even like, "Whoa, Nellie, this is a big one," right? So they're afraid. And we'll stop there, and we'll talk about the importance of Jesus walking on the water tomorrow. That'll take us long.
My dad's